The orbital scrapyard of Kestrel Ring drifted silently against the backdrop of a dying star. A graveyard of forgotten ships, broken satellites, and abandoned machinery that no longer held value for the civilized worlds. And yet for those who lived on the edges of society, it was a place of survival, where scraps became livelihood and decay became opportunity. And among those who called this rusting labyrinth home was a human engineer named Elias Vance, a man who had long since stopped expecting anything extraordinary from life, his days filled with the quiet, repetitive work of dismantling wreckage, salvaging usable parts, and repairing what others had discarded. His hands always stained with grease, his mind always calculating, always fixing, because in a place like Kestrel Ring, survival didn't reward dreams. It rewarded persistence. It was supposed to be just another job. A drifting hulk had been flagged on the outer edge of the ring, its transponder long dead, its structure barely intact, but scans showed it still held pockets of intact systems. Valuable if carefully extracted, and Elias, like always, took the contract without hesitation, guiding his small salvage craft through the maze of floating debris, the faint hum of his engines the only sound breaking the vacuum as he approached the derelict vessel. Its hull scorched and fractured, its design unfamiliar, older than anything commonly seen in the ring, and that alone made it interesting enough to warrant caution. "Let's see what you're hiding," Elias muttered under his breath as he aligned with a fractured docking port, his ship's magnetic clamps locking into place with a dull thud that reverberated faintly through the hull, and after running a quick scan for atmospheric integrity, he sealed his suit and cycled the airlock, stepping into the cold, silent interior of the abandoned ship. The darkness inside was thick, almost suffocating, broken only by the narrow beam of his helmet light as it cut through layers of dust and drifting particles, illuminating corridors that had long since lost power. Their walls lined with ancient markings and structural designs that didn't match any known human or common alien architecture. And Elias felt a faint sense of unease settle in his chest, not fear exactly, but something close to it, because this place didn't feel empty. It felt forgotten. Still, work was work. He moved forward carefully, scanning as he went, marking sections of salvageable material, noting structural weaknesses, his mind falling into the familiar rhythm of assessment and calculation. And for a while, everything was normal, predictable, exactly as expected, until he reached the inner chamber. The door was massive, sealed by a mechanism that had partially fused with age, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed almost organic in their design, and as Elias studied it, something about it felt deliberate, as if whatever lay beyond had been meant to stay hidden, untouched, and for a moment, he considered turning back, marking the site as too unstable to risk, but then his scanner picked up something that made him pause. A heat signature. Faint, but present. Elias frowned, adjusting the settings to confirm it, and there it was again, weak, inconsistent, but unmistakably alive, and that changed everything because abandoned ships didn't have survivors, not after this long, not after the kind of damage this one had sustained, and yet something was still here. "All right?" he murmured, stepping closer to the door. "Now I'm curious." It took effort to force the mechanism open, his tools grinding against ancient metal as he worked to pry it apart, the resistance stubborn but not impossible, and after several minutes of focused effort, the seal finally gave way with a low, echoing groan, the door shifting just enough for him to slip through. What he found on the other side was not what he expected. The chamber beyond was vast, its ceiling arching high above, supported by structures that resembled ribs more than beams, and at its center lay something enormous, coiled and unmoving, its form partially obscured by shadow and layers of dust that had settled over it like a second skin. And for a moment, Elias simply stood there, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A dragon, not a creature of myth or legend, but a real, physical being. Its massive body curled in on itself, its scales dulled with age and neglect. Their once bright color faded into a pale, almost ghostly hue, and as Elias stepped closer, his breath caught slightly as he realized just how old it looked, how worn, how abandoned. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. His scanner confirmed it. Alive. Barely. The dragon's breathing was slow, shallow, its massive chest rising and falling with visible effort, and as Elias circled carefully, keeping his distance, he noticed something else, chains. Not physical ones, but something far worse. Embedded into the structure around the dragon were crystalline nodes, each one faintly glowing with a dim, dying energy, their placement deliberate, forming a containment field that wrapped around the creature like an invisible cage, suppressing its movement, its strength, its very existence, and even without fully understanding the technology, Elias could see what it had done. It had kept her here, trapped, for a very long time. "Who the hell would do this?" he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief as he stepped closer, his eyes tracing the intricate system that had held her in place for what could have been decades, centuries, even, and as he reached out, hesitating only briefly before placing a hand against one of the inactive nodes, something shifted. The dragon's eye opened, slowly, deliberately, and in that moment, everything changed. It wasn't just an eye, it was a presence, ancient, tired, and filled with a depth of loneliness that hit Elias harder than anything else he had seen in that chamber. For a long second, neither of them moved, human and dragon, stranger and prisoner. Then, in a voice so faint it barely seemed real, the dragon spoke. "Why are you here?" Elias swallowed, his hand still resting against the cold surface of the containment node, his mind racing through a dozen possible answers before settling on the only one that felt honest. "I came looking for scrap," he said quietly. A pause. Then something unexpected, the faintest shift in her expression. Not anger, not fear, something closer to sad amusement. "Of course," she whispered. Elias glanced around the chamber again, taking in the chains, the decay, the quiet, suffocating emptiness of a place that had been designed to be forgotten, and then he looked back at her, really looked this time. Not as a salvage opportunity, not as a problem to solve, but as something else entirely. As someone who had been left behind. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The dragon's eye dimmed slightly, her voice barely more than breath. 160 years. The number settled heavily in the air. Elias felt something twist in his chest, something sharp and uncomfortable, because no one, no living being, should have been left like this, not for that long, not in silence, not in chains, and as he looked at the containment system again, at the failing nodes, at the fragile line between life and death that this creature balanced on, a thought began to form. A dangerous one, complicated one, but one he couldn't ignore. "I'm an engineer," he said slowly. The dragon's eye shifted toward him. "And?" she asked faintly. Elias took a breath, then let it out, his decision settling into place with quiet certainty. "And I think," he said, his voice steady despite everything, "I can get you out of here. Dragon." For a long moment after Elias Vance spoke those words, the chamber seemed to fall into a deeper kind of silence, one that pressed in from all sides as if even the ancient ship itself was listening, waiting to see whether this fragile, impossible promise would hold any truth, and the dragon, still coiled within the failing lattice of crystalline restraints, did not respond immediately, her single open eye fixed on him with a gaze that held not hope, not yet, but something far more cautious, something shaped by a century and a half of abandonment, betrayal, and time that had stretched so long it had worn even expectation into nothing. "No one breaks these," she said at last, her voice faint but steady in its certainty, as though she had repeated that truth to herself countless times over the years, each repetition slowly turning it into something absolute. "They were made to last." Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the nearest crystalline node, crouching beside it as his gloved fingers traced the fractured edges where faint energy still pulsed like a dying heartbeat, and his mind shifted into the familiar rhythm of analysis, breaking the impossible into smaller, solvable parts, because that was what he did. He fixed things, not by overpowering them, but by understanding them. "Everything breaks," he said quietly. "Just depends on how it was built, and how it's failing." He activated his scanner again, sweeping it slowly across the chamber, mapping out the network of nodes that formed the containment field, each one linked in a complex pattern that fed into a central control system embedded deep within the structure itself. And the more he studied it, the clearer the design became. Not just a prison, but a system meant to suppress, to drain, to keep its occupant alive just enough to endure the confinement indefinitely. "Whoever did this didn't want you dead," Elias muttered half to himself. The dragon's eye shifted slightly. "No," she whispered. "Death would have been kinder." That statement lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable, but Elias didn't dwell on it. Not because it didn't matter, but because focusing on it wouldn't change what needed to be done. And right now, there was only one thing that mattered: getting her out. "The system's degrading," he said after a moment, pointing to one of the nodes. "Power flow is unstable. Some of these links are already dead." He moved to another, tapping lightly against its cracked surface. "But it's still active enough to hold you. Which means if I just start breaking things." He shook his head slightly. "It could collapse wrong. Hurt you. Or worse." The dragon closed her eye briefly, as if the idea of worse had long since lost its meaning. "Then leave," she said quietly. "Take what you came for. I have endured this long. I will endure longer." Elias stood still for a second, staring at her. Not at the massive, ancient creature before him, but at what those words really meant, at the resignation buried inside them, and something in his expression hardened just slightly, not with anger, but with quiet refusal. "No," he said simply. The word echoed faintly through the chamber. The dragon's eye opened again, focusing on him with a flicker of something new. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. Elias straightened, brushing dust from his gloves as he glanced around the chamber once more. His mind already mapping out a plan, piecing together the steps, the risks, the timing. "If I walk away now," he continued, "then I'm just another part of whatever put you here in the first place." He met her gaze directly. "And I'm not doing that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, the dragon exhaled. A long, quiet breath that carried something fragile within it. Not quite hope, but no longer the complete absence of it. "You are strange," she murmured. Elias allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Yeah," he said. "I've been told that." He moved quickly after that, setting down his tool pack and pulling out a compact interface device, linking it carefully to one of the less damaged nodes. His movements precise and deliberate as he began feeding data into his scanner, trying to map the control pathways without triggering any defensive responses from the system. And for a while, the only sound in the chamber was the soft hum of his equipment and the steady, shallow rhythm of the dragon's breathing. Minutes passed, then longer. Elias worked without pause, adjusting frequencies, rerouting signals, testing small disruptions to see how the system responded, each step bringing him closer to understanding the intricate web that held her in place, and slowly a pattern began to emerge, not just in the structure of the system but in its weakness. "There you are," he muttered under his breath. The dragon's eye shifted toward him again. "What do you see?" "A flaw," Elias replied, his voice carrying a quiet note of satisfaction. "Not a big one, but enough." He pointed toward the far side of the chamber, where a cluster of nodes pulsed unevenly, their light flickering more erratically than the others. "That section's failing faster than the rest. If I can isolate it, redirect the load." He glanced back at her. "I can bring the whole system down without it collapsing on you." The dragon was silent for a moment, processing that, and then very carefully, she asked, "And if you are wrong?" Elias didn't hesitate. "Then it kills me first." Another silence, but this one felt different, heavier, real. The dragon studied him for a long time, her ancient gaze searching his face as if trying to understand something beyond logic, beyond reason. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than before, carrying a weight that hadn't been there earlier. "Why?" It wasn't suspicion this time. It was something else. Elias paused, his hands stilling briefly over his tools as he considered the question, and for a moment he almost dismissed it, almost gave a simple answer and moved on. But something about the way she asked it made him stop, made him actually think. "Because no one should be left like this," he said finally. The words were quiet, simple, but they carried a truth that filled the space between them. The dragon's eye dimmed slightly, and though she didn't respond, something in her expression shifted again. Something subtle but undeniable, as if a part of her that had long since gone silent had stirred, just a little. Elias returned to work, the plan now clear in his mind, his movements faster but no less precise as he began implementing the sequence he had designed, carefully isolating the unstable nodes, rerouting energy flows, creating a controlled imbalance that would allow the system to collapse inward instead of outward. And as he worked, the chamber itself seemed to react, the faint hum of the containment field fluctuating, the light of the nodes dimming and brightening in uneven pulses. "It is changing," the dragon said quietly. "Yeah," Elias replied, not looking up. "That's the idea." The air grew heavier as the system destabilized, the energy that had once held her in place beginning to unravel, and for the first time, the dragon shifted more freely within her coils, testing the edges of her confinement, feeling the subtle give where before there had been none. "I can feel it," she whispered. Elias nodded, his focus unwavering. "Almost there. One final adjustment. One last command." And then, the chamber erupted with a sharp, resonant crack as the containment field collapsed, the crystalline nodes shattering almost simultaneously, their light extinguishing in a cascade of fading energy that rippled through the space like the breaking of an invisible chain. Silence followed. Deep, absolute. The dragon did not move at first, as if she couldn't, as if after 160 years, she didn't quite believe it was real. Then slowly, she stretched, her massive form uncoiling for the first time in over a century, her wings trembling as they extended, her body shifting with a stiffness that spoke of long confinement. And as she rose, truly rose, the chamber seemed smaller somehow, unable to contain the presence that had been held back for so long. Elias stepped back, watching quietly, giving her space. The dragon took a breath, full one, and when she exhaled, it wasn't weak. It wasn't broken. It was alive. Her gaze turned to him once more, no longer dim, no longer distant, but clear, ancient, powerful, and filled with something that hadn't been there before. "Freedom." "Engineer," she said softly. Elias raised an eyebrow slightly. "Elias," he corrected. Faint pause. Then, "Elias," she repeated. And in that moment, everything had changed. Dragon. For a long moment after the last of the crystalline restraints shattered into lifeless fragments, the chamber remained suspended in a kind of quiet disbelief, as though even the ancient walls could not yet accept that the presence they had held captive for 160 years was no longer bound, and Elias Vance stood near the edge of the room, his breath steady but his heart still racing from the precision and risk of what he had just done, watching as the dragon, now fully uncoiled, slowly adjusted to the unfamiliar sensation of freedom, her massive wings trembling as they stretched outward, not in dominance or threat, but in cautious testing, like someone relearning how to move after being still for far too long. Her movements were slow at first, careful, each shift of her body deliberate, as if she expected the invisible chains to return at any moment, to snap back into place and remind her that escape was never meant to happen. But they didn't, and as seconds turned into minutes, that realization began to settle, sinking deeper into her awareness until it could no longer be denied. She was free, truly free. Elias watched her take a step forward, just one, and even that seemed to carry weight, the faint echo of her claws against the chamber floor resonating like something far greater than the simple act itself, and for a moment, he found himself holding his breath again, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect, because this wasn't just a creature moving. This was someone reclaiming something that had been taken from her for longer than most lives lasted. "I had forgotten," she said softly, her voice stronger now, no longer fading into the air but carrying a depth that filled the chamber with quiet presence. What it felt like to stand without pain. Elias let out a small breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah," he said. "That system wasn't exactly built for comfort." The dragon turned her head slightly, her gaze settling on him again. But this time it was different. Not distant, not uncertain, but focused, aware, and carrying a clarity that hadn't been there before. "You broke what my clan could not," she said. Elias shrugged lightly, though the weight of her words wasn't lost on him. "Your clan probably didn't have access to half-broken salvage tech and bad ideas," he replied. "Sometimes that helps." There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted in her expression, subtle but unmistakable. Amusement, faint but real. "Perhaps," she murmured. But the moment didn't last, because as her gaze drifted past him, toward the fractured doorway and the long, silent corridors beyond. Something darker returned to her expression, something tied not to the present, but to the past she had just escaped. "They left me here," she said quietly. Elias followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "The ones who built this?" he asked. A slow shake of her head. "My own kind," she replied. That stopped him. Not completely, but enough. Elias frowned slightly, trying to process that, because it was one thing to imagine enemies, captors, unknown forces doing something like this, but her own clan? That added a different kind of weight to the story, one that felt far more complicated than simple cruelty. "Why?" he asked. The dragon was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, as if she were looking far beyond the walls of the ship, far beyond the present moment, into memories that had not faded despite the passage of time. "Because I was no longer useful," she said at last. The simplicity of the answer made it worse. Elias let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. "That's cold," he muttered. "It is our way," she replied, though there was no pride in her voice, no defense, only a quiet acknowledgement. "Strength is valued. Power. Purpose. When those fade—" She paused, her gaze lowering slightly. "So do we." Elias studied her for a moment, taking in the worn edges of her scales, the subtle signs of age that had been made worse by long confinement, the quiet strength that still remained beneath it all, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, not exactly, but something close to it. "Then your way's broken," he said simply. The dragon's head lifted slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. Not in anger, but in something closer to surprise. "You judge what you do not understand," she said. "Maybe," Elias replied, "but I understand enough to know leaving someone locked up for 160 years isn't strength." He met her gaze directly. "It's cowardice." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and unfiltered, and for a brief moment, the chamber felt tense again, not with hostility, but with the weight of something unspoken being brought into the open, and the dragon held his gaze, searching his face for something, hesitation, fear, regret, but she found none. Only honesty. After a long pause, she exhaled slowly. "Your kind speaks boldly," she said. Elias gave a small shrug. "Someone's got to." Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful, as if something in the space between them had shifted once more, moving from simple interaction into something deeper, something built not just on circumstance, but on understanding, however incomplete it might be. Then suddenly, the ship groaned. A deep, structural sound that echoed through the chamber, followed by a sharp tremor beneath their feet that sent dust falling from the ceiling and loose fragments of metal clattering against the floor. And Elias's head snapped upward instantly, his instincts kicking in as his mind raced through the implications. "That's not good," he muttered. The dragon tensed, her body reacting immediately to the shift in the environment. "What is happening?" Elias moved quickly toward his scanner, activating it and checking the structural readings, his expression tightening as the data came through. "The containment system wasn't just holding you," he said. "It was stabilizing part of the ship. When it collapsed—" He looked up at her. "So did everything it was supporting." Another tremor hit, stronger this time. Cracks spread along the walls, thin at first but widening with each passing second. The ancient structure finally giving way after centuries of strain, and Elias grabbed his tool pack, slinging it over his shoulder as he turned toward the exit. "We've got to move," he said sharply. "Now." The dragon didn't hesitate. Whatever stiffness remained in her body was pushed aside as she followed him, her movements growing more confident with each step, her size making the narrow corridors a challenge, but not an obstacle she couldn't overcome, and together, they moved quickly through the failing ship, the path back to the docking port now a race against time as the structure around them continued to collapse. Metal screamed. Walls buckled. The floor beneath them shifted dangerously as entire sections of the ship began to break apart, drifting into open space as the artificial gravity failed in uneven bursts, and Elias pushed forward, guiding them through the maze of corridors with sharp, decisive movements, his familiarity with unstable structures keeping them one step ahead of disaster. "Left!" he called out, darting around a collapsing support beam just as it crashed down behind them. This way, the dragon followed, her wings pulling tight against her body as she navigated the narrow passages. Her movements growing faster, stronger. The signs of her former power beginning to return with each passing second of freedom. Another explosion rocked the ship. Closer this time. Elias stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wall before pushing forward again. His ship now visible through the fractured docking corridor ahead, its exterior lights blinking steadily like a beacon against the chaos. Almost there, he shouted. The final stretch was the most dangerous. The corridor began to tear itself apart even as they ran, sections of it breaking away into open space, the vacuum beyond pulling at anything not secured, and Elias didn't slow, didn't hesitate. He jumped the final gap, landing hard on the docking platform before turning back immediately. The dragon was right behind him. With a powerful movement, she leapt across the collapsing space, her massive form clearing the gap just as the corridor behind her gave way completely, vanishing into the void with a violent rush of air and debris. They made it. Barely. Elias slammed the airlock controls, the doors sealing shut with a heavy clang as the pressure equalized. The chaos outside cut off in an instant, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the low hum of the ship's systems. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elias let out a long breath, leaning back against the wall. "Okay," he said. "That was close." Across from him, the dragon stood tall within the confined space, her presence filling it completely, her eyes no longer dim, no longer distant, but alive in a way they hadn't been when he first found her. "You risk much," she said quietly. Elias gave a tired half-smile. "Yeah," he replied, starting to notice that. Another pause. Then, "I have not yet given my name," she said. Elias looked up at her. The dragon lowered her head slightly, her voice steady, clear, and carrying the weight of everything she had endured, and everything she had just regained. "I am Vaelithra." Elias nodded once. "Good to meet you," he said, and as the broken ship drifted apart outside, fading into the endless expanse of space, one thing became clear in that quiet, enclosed moment. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Dragon. For a while after the airlock sealed and the violent collapse of the ancient ship faded into distant silence, neither Elias nor Vaelithra spoke, as if both of them understood, without needing to say it, that what had just happened was too large to immediately process, too heavy with consequence, and too unfamiliar in its outcome, because freedom, especially after 160 years of absence, was not something that settled gently into the mind or body. It arrived all at once, overwhelming and uncertain, and Vaelithra stood within the confined space of Elias's vessel, her presence filling every corner of it, her wings partially folded but still brushing dangerously close to the walls, her eyes moving slowly across her surroundings as she absorbed every detail with quiet intensity, like someone relearning how to exist in a world that had continued without her for far too long. Elias finally pushed himself off the wall with a small exhale, his exhaustion beginning to catch up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. But even then, his attention remained sharp, practical, grounded in the reality of what came next, because rescuing an ancient dragon from a collapsing alien prison was one thing. Figuring out what to do afterward was something else entirely. "So," he said after a moment, running a hand through his hair as he glanced toward the cockpit. "Next problem." Vaelithra's gaze shifted to him. "Problem?" Elias nodded, gesturing vaguely around them. "Yeah, this ship? Not exactly designed for well." He glanced at her full size, then back at the narrow interior. "You." There was no offense in her expression, only quiet acknowledgement. "I see," she said. Another small silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, both of them adjusting to the reality of each other's existence, both of them standing at the edge of something neither had planned for. "Where will you go?" Elias asked eventually. Vaelithra didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted, not toward the ship, not toward him, but somewhere beyond both. Somewhere distant, unseen, tied to a past that had clearly not left her untouched. "I do not know," she admitted. That, more than anything else, seemed to settle something in Elias's mind. He nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a decision he had already begun to make. Then you're not going back to them, he said. Her eyes returned to him, sharper now. My clan. Yeah, Elias replied. The ones who left you. He shrugged lightly. Doesn't sound like they deserve a reunion. There was a flicker of something in her expression. Not anger, not quite, but something deeper, more complicated. They are still my kind, she said. And they still abandoned you, Elias countered calmly. The words weren't harsh. They didn't need to be. Velithra held his gaze for a long moment, and then, slowly, she exhaled, her posture shifting just slightly. Not weakening, but easing, as if she were allowing herself, for the first time, to consider something she had not permitted before. Perhaps, she said quietly, they are no longer mine. Elias didn't respond immediately, but something in his expression softened, not with sympathy, but with understanding. Then we figure out something better, he said. Another silence followed, but this one felt different, lighter, as if the weight that had once filled the space between them had begun to lift, even if only slightly. Elias turned toward the cockpit and motioned for her to follow, though the gesture was almost unnecessary. There wasn't much room for her to go anywhere else, and as he settled into the pilot's seat, powering up the ship systems, the soft hum of engines coming back to life, Velithra lowered herself carefully behind him, her massive form coiling just enough to fit within the limited space. Her movements far more controlled now, far more aware of her surroundings than they had been in the first. Moments after her release, the viewport flickered on, revealing the remains of the ancient vessel drifting apart in slow, silent pieces against the vast darkness of space, its broken structure scattering into nothingness, as if time itself had finally decided to let it go. Velithra watched it in silence. It held me for so long, she murmured. Elias adjusted the controls, guiding his ship away from the debris field. Not anymore, he said. There was no ceremony, no final moment of closure, just distance, growing steadily as they left it behind. For a while, they traveled without speaking, the quiet hum of the ship filling the space between them, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was one filled with thought, with adjustment, with the slow process of two very different beings learning how to exist in the same place without conflict, without fear. Eventually, Velithra spoke again. You're kind, she said. You help others like this? Elias glanced back at her briefly, then returned his focus to the controls. Some do, he replied. Some don't. He gave a small shrug. Humans are mixed. You did not have to help me, she said. No, Elias agreed. Another pause. Yet you did. Elias leaned back slightly in his seat, considering that. Yeah, he said. I guess I did. Velithra studied him for a moment, her ancient gaze thoughtful, measuring something that went beyond logic, beyond simple cause and effect. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a depth that felt almost unfamiliar compared to the quiet resignation it had once held. Then perhaps your kind is stronger than mine, she said. Elias huffed a quiet laugh. Wouldn't go that far, he replied. We just try sometimes. The ship continued forward, leaving behind the wreckage of the past and moving into open space, into uncertainty, into possibility, and for the first time since her imprisonment, Velithra did not look back again. Instead, she shifted slightly, adjusting her position as she lowered her head closer to the viewport, watching the stars stretch endlessly before them, her expression no longer distant, no longer hollow, but present. Alive. Elias, she said after a while. Yeah. What is your purpose? The question caught him off guard. Not because it was difficult, but because it was simple in a way he hadn't expected, and he took a moment before answering, his gaze drifting briefly toward the stars ahead. I fix things, he said finally. Velithra tilted her head slightly. Things? Elias smiled faintly. Ships, systems, mistakes. He glanced back at her. Sometimes, situations. There was a pause. Then, very subtly, Velithra's posture shifted again. Something in her presence changing, not in size or strength, but in meaning, in direction. as if a path that had once ended in darkness had suddenly extended forward into something unknown, something unwritten. Then perhaps, she said slowly, you have not finished your work. Elias raised an eyebrow. Oh, her gaze met his steady and clear. Because I am still broken, she said. The words were quiet, but they carried no shame, no weakness, only truth. Elias studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his seat with a small, thoughtful exhale. Yeah, he said. I noticed. Faint pause. Then just barely he smiled. But I'm working on it. For the first time since her release, Valithra did not look like something that had been abandoned. She looked like something that had survived. And as the ship carried them forward into the unknown, one thing became certain. This wasn't just the story of a rescue. It was the beginning of something far more rare. Not ownership, not obligation, but trust. Dragon,